Hey guys, welcome and thank you for listening to the first episode of What on Earth. I'm your host, Alec Terry. My guest today is Mr. Evan Price, who's chairman of CO2 Solutions, which is a company using enzymatic CO2 capture for a broad range of industries. In addition, he's also the chairman of IOU Financial, an online provider of business loans in the United States, and a board member of Solofor, one of the province of Quebec's largest private owners of timberlands. He's an active philanthropist who serves on the board of the Rideau Hall Foundation. He holds an MBA from INSEAD, Fontainebleau, France, and I'm sure I'm butchering the French, but I'm going to try anyway, and a Bachelor's of Science in Forestry Engineering from Laval University. So I hope you enjoy my interview with Mr. Evan Price.
Okay, and we're live.
Hi, Alex.
All right, Mr. Price, just want to thank you again for joining me. Really do appreciate the time. And I understand that CO2 Solutions' main product is enzymatic CO2 capture, if I'm saying that correctly. Could you explain that to the audience?
Sure. So enzymatic means we use an enzyme to capture CO2. So if you go back to the beginning of the technology, we were developing a method of removing CO2, carbon dioxide, from the ambient air of a submarine. And in submarines, there are small CO2 capture plants that use a process called an amine process. And these typically have use a toxic chemical called an amine. And they were looking for another way. So the idea was not to have there were a few toxic elements in a submarine. So they were looking for something non-toxic, and that led them to using this enzyme. Now, the enzyme that we use is carbonic anhydrase. It's the same enzyme that is used by humans and animals to regulate the intake and release of CO2 in our bodies. So this is an important function for our bodies. Our bodies are made of carbon, and so they need the CO2 molecule for that purpose. And we took that enzyme and we adapted it for industrial environments, so to capture CO2 from a flue gas, and that basically became the enzymatic process.
Wow, so this was actually, and you said this started on submarines, is that correct?
Yeah, it was a research project with the Royal Canadian Navy on how to remove the CO2 from a submarine. And, we demonstrated the concept. We get calls every once in a while from a Navy looking to do something like that in their submarines. We haven't done any business there. It's a pretty difficult environment to do business in, but we prefer the much larger market, which is the capture of CO2 from industrial flue gases.
Okay, so how does that work? I'm just a little curious about the business model there. So is it something that you go and you set up some sort of, technology to use with that company, or do they come to you? How does that?
Typically we might contact a company, or they might contact us. This is a company that will have a plant, a factory that is burning a fossil fuel of some sort. It could be coal, it could be diesel, it could be natural gas, it could be oil, it could be whatever. It could even be wood. I mean, it could be a biomass as well. But the idea is that there's some in the flue gas, there is coming out of the plant, there is CO2, and typically it's between, say, 3 and 15% of the flue gas is carbon dioxide. So what we do is we bring our plant, our unit, our CO2 capture unit, next to this emitting plant, the source of emission, and we run the flue gas, so what's commonly known as smoke, through our equipment. When we do that, the process removes the CO2 molecules up to 90%. Really depends on the different configurations that we'll use, but sort of draws out 90%. And then at the back end, we pull out the CO2, and then we make the CO2 available. And available for what? Principally two directions. One of them is sequestration, which is pumping it underground and burying it. Or the other one is taking the CO2 and reutilizing it, or reuse, or converting it into some value-added product.
And what would be some examples of those value-added products?
Today there's a number of well-known value-added products for that use CO2. In fact, CO2 is an industrial gas that there's around 30 million tons of CO2 sold for use as an industrial gas for things like in a soda, you have to inject CO2. That's an example. Or in a greenhouse, you want to increase the concentration of CO2 in a greenhouse. Plants prefer to grow in that kind of environment, so that's the second example. And there's also examples in water treatment, in the manufacturing of pulp, and so on. So there's many industrial applications for CO2. That's not very well known. Another very large application for CO2 is what's called enhanced oil recovery. So, for example, about 20% of oil produced in Texas uses CO2 to enhance the production. So why? Because these are typically in depleted oil fields where the oil drawn from, let's say, the more common practices of oil production has already been taken, and there's still oil underground, but very difficult to obtain. When you inject CO2 underground, it changes the viscosity of the oil, and then more oil comes out of that same well. So, as I say, about 20% of the oil production in Texas today uses this technique, and it's found in many other places around the world.
Wow, there seems like there's quite a few industrial applications. I'm honestly surprised. Not really knowing much about it, it really surprises me just how many different uses there are for it.
In fact, there's a lot more coming on stream as well right now. So what I indicated to you was what I'll call first generation CO2 utilization technologies. So these are things that have been around for a long time. But what's interesting is that there's a whole industry that's building up around this as people stop viewing CO2 as waste and view it as a molecule to work with, a feedstock of interest. So this is where everything is heading. It's a little bit like domestic waste. Before, where everything would go into the garbage, now we do some recycling and things like that. Same thing is happening with the CO2 molecule. So what's going on is around the world, in universities, research centers, companies, and so on, are looking at, is there some value that we can generate from the CO2 molecule? And we have a project ongoing right now, which is a CO2 capture and utilization project that has started off by looking around the world what is out there. And we scoured and found 125 different technologies, and there's probably a lot more, but let's say the easiest 125 to find we found. And these are technologies that are transforming CO2 into, I'll give you a few categories. Well, biofuels is one. Biochemicals is another. Injection into materials, like making cement out of CO2. And the third one is making food, like protein for animals, out of CO2. So these are four different types of applications that are that we're looking at, that you can put all these technologies into those four categories, and there's a lot of different things that are going on in that space. So if we talk about this in, say, 5 years' time, we're going to find that there's a lot of applications going on mainstream that are using CO2. And in fact, there's been a study that was done by McKinsey and Company, the well-known consulting firm, that estimated by 2030 this would be an $800 billion business worldwide. So we're talking massive amounts, and we're talking about in the gigatons of, I believe it was like 7 gigatons of CO2 would be converted in this way in just a short, what are we now, 12 years away.
That's incredible. And I mean, you hit on such a good point too, is why not use what was formerly considered a waste product as a profit center for these companies, and to stymie the tide of CO2 being released in the atmosphere at the same time. Yeah,
really. I mean, there's a different way of viewing things today. Before we were very concerned by energy per se. In other words, it was like we were going to be run short of energy. We were going to run out of oil, or solar panels were too expensive, and all that kind of stuff. So we're very, very focused on energy. In fact, energy is one element that really we're not going to run out of. And the reason is quite simple. The world uses, all told, as much energy as the sun provides us in an hour. Okay, so it's that crazy, the equation.
Right.
So we're not going to run out of energy. Okay, as long as the sun is out there, we're going to be okay. But what we are running out of is material, is feedstock, is the resources. Those we're running out of, and so on. And so this is where recycling is very important, especially with the growing population. It's very important. So the idea of taking something and just wasting it and throwing it into the atmosphere doesn't make sense. And people are much more focused on the resource, on the material. We're short of material. We're not short of energy. And so that's very much playing what we're doing and with CO2 is very much in sync with that movement.
Great. So I know that you are currently involved with the X Prize. Am I correct in saying that? Okay, so the X Prize put on by Peter Diamandis, among others. And from what I gather, with the CO2, they're looking to provide some sort of product. So I was just wondering what product we're using, what are some of the criteria for the incentive competition. Just want to see how that plays into your overall growth strategy.
Well, a prize is, a prize like this is fun. I mean, especially if you're in it and you think you got a good chance of winning. And so it's like you got to view it a little bit as the cherry on the sundae. Okay, so I wouldn't say it's part of our overall strategy. Of course, we're going to try to maximize whatever we can do out of the prizes, as much as possible. But it's sort of a kind of a nice to have, and let's see what happens. We don't totally control the process, as you can imagine. So we're sort of going along. We entered the X Prize with a combination, because the X Prize you have to take flue gas and then deliver a product. Okay, not CO2 and deliver a product. So we got to go right up, to the source, and the source is flue gas. So we use, first of all, our CO2 capture technology to capture CO2 from the flue gas. So this is to give you an idea, in this round of the X Prize, we have to demonstrate 200 kilos of CO2 capture per day. We've already demonstrated 10 tons per day. So that's about 50 times more. So we're way ahead of, what the requirements. The second thing is we're going to transform the CO2 into the product that we've chosen is dimethyl ether, so often known by its acronym of DME. DME is a very interesting fuel. It can be blended with diesel, so it becomes a bit of a clean diesel without the emissions that come with diesel, or it can be blended in with propane. And propane is a very high value product. So this is the direction that we're heading in with our X Prize. But interestingly, there's another side about X Prize is that a lot of the companies that are entered into the prize did not have the front end technology, i.e. the carbon capture technology. They just came with a CO2 utilization technology, just the downstream stuff. So what we've done with the permission of the X Prize people is that we have partnered with a number of them. So we have 2 full entries of our own technologies on our own, and we've got 6 ones where we're entered in partnership with other companies. So, and these companies do a number of things. A little bit like we were talking about before. Some do animal proteins. Some inject into materials. Some do biofuels. I mean, it's just a mix of different applications. So there's about 24 companies involved at this stage, and the announcement will take place on April 9 or 10, or maybe it's one of those 2 days in New York, just in a couple of months.
Sounds like you guys have a pretty good chance.
We like our odds.
Yeah, I'd say so. That's great. So I'm a little curious, because I've never heard of this, of using CO2 capture. I've heard of the biofuels, but I think one that's a little less known is using it for animal feed. Just a little more details about that process, maybe. Just curious about that.
Yeah, so this is not our process, but there are ways of taking CO2 and transforming it into animal feed. One of the interesting things about this technology, it's developed by a company in California called Kiverdi, Kiverdi, and there's quite a neat TED Talk by the CEO of Kiverdi, whose name is Lisa Dyson. And this technology actually was developed as part of NASA's Mars project. So on a flight to Mars, you will be in a spaceship, maybe an Elon Musk spaceship, I don't know, but maybe a spaceship for a couple of years. Okay, so it's a long ride. So what are you going to eat for a couple of years? And the payload is going to be counted down to the gram. So you can't sort of stack it up with all your favorite foods for a couple of years. That would be too heavy. So basically, what's going to be going on there, whether, I don't know if the astronauts know it or not, but basically the idea that it was developed by NASA was that you would use your CO2 that you're emitting in the spaceship and then convert that into food, basically. So, and that was one of the ways that was considered. And so they basically took this idea and then applied it, not for human consumption. I mean, not that it's going to kill any human, but just that I don't think here we're going to stand up. We want a little bit more variety in our menu, but for animal feed, and particularly, animal feed. The production of animal feed is one of has got a major impact on climate change. Just imagine the deforestation in the Amazon basin, for example, and also for fish meal. So fish meal is also animal feed. And where does fish meal comes from? Well, fish meal comes from other fish, and there is right now a shortage of fish, natural fish, and naturally caught fish, and so this is a replacement of that for the fish farms. And so those are just a couple of ideas there.
I did not know that. That's actually and that makes total sense too. I mean, why would you carry conventional food? Because obviously conventional food, would not be the most economical to carry. So that makes a ton of sense.
If you go back and watch the movie The Martian with you can see a little bit some of the issues. Yeah, with Matt Damon, you can see a little bit some of the issues there. So it's not, so I don't see him eating his CO2, but there are some issues there. On Mars there is water. On Mars there is CO2. So those are the things you have to work with.
Right, that's very true. Was a little curious more about the funding, the founding and eventual funding of CO2 Solutions. What was it like back, I believe it was 97, if I'm correct?
Correct, yeah. So 97, we were founded in 97. I can't tell you exactly what it was like because I wasn't there, but so I joined the company as chairman about 10 years ago, so 2008, so about, halfway through. But basically the start of the company was this Navy project, and there was research done out of the university, and at that time, if you go back 97, the whole concept of people did know. I mean, the first person who identified the impact of CO2 on climate change, that goes back 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century. So in 97, if you were scientifically minded, you knew about it, but it really wasn't part of popular common knowledge and so on. So it wasn't broadly known. So they were a little bit ahead of themselves, and then came the Kyoto Accord. That was 2002, so that was like a major step along the progression of the company. And then as the understanding of the impact of CO2 and climate change became prevalent, then the company picked up momentum along the way, got increased support both from investors and from governments. So we've had a lot of support from governments over the year that has enabled the company to develop its technology over time.
Absolutely. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges on the horizon for you coming up? Obviously, you have a lot in your favor. I'm sure as any industry, you have some challenges and some roadblocks up ahead as well. Would you be able to describe some of those?
Yeah, the usual roadblock for small companies is time. That's the biggest one. So we've got to move. We've got to move quickly. Every day is a big day, and so on. So it's really the challenge of time. And we're dealing, as small companies, we're dealing with two kind of large organizations, types of organizations. One of them is governments, and the other one is big industry. So, who are the emitters? These are big companies. Actually, if you look around, the concentration of I think it's something like 80% of CO2 emissions take place in around 80 companies around the world. That's it. If you just solve the problem of 80 companies, you basically solve the problem. And so it's very, very concentrated. And so but these are also, both of these groups are very slow moving, very prudent, and very risk averse. So it's those are always challenges, and it doesn't really matter what industry. I mean, our industry is just like pretty much any kind of industry where you have small companies dealing with big ones, and see that time is usually the piece that is the most worrisome. You often what keeps the CEO of one of these companies awake? Well, time is a big one.
Oh, I understand that. So curious, and hopefully some of the people in the audience will be curious too, what kind of people you look to hire, say if you're a recent grad, or if you're just getting into college now and you're looking for a path to pursue. What sort of background and education do you look for? What sort of experience do you look for?
Yeah, we look for there's maybe three types of employees that we look for. So from a scientific side, it's a lot of biology, biochemistry, a lot of work around the enzyme, and so it can be at the scientist level, it can be the technician level, but those are interesting jobs. I mean, it's a biotechnology. Enzyme is not it's like a protein. It's not a living organism, but it is a biological product, so it's got to be approached that way. Happens very much at the microscopic level, so really, really small. You can never see the enzymes; so tiny. But and then as we deploy our technologies, then we're talking about engineering. So in our case, we work a lot with chemical engineers. So that's a very interesting field. In fact, I would strongly encourage anybody in your audience, any scientifically minded people, that doesn't really matter what field you're interested in, but chemical engineering is something that can bring you to many different directions and many different types of industries or applications and so on. It's very broad application, applications for this discipline. And then the last area is in business development. Of course, that's important. And in business development, in a field like ours, you need to have a scientific background, at least a minimal scientific background, to be able to engage professionally with our customers. So it's a little bit. Those are the three areas. Of course, we've got all the other support staff, but those are the three key areas in the company.
Okay. And lastly, where can people find you? Decide and support you and spread the news.
Well, we've got there's many different ways. Sorry. So of course we have our website. We've got a Facebook page. We've got an Instagram account where we send out news on ourselves, so they can follow us there. Our news, we're a publicly listed company on the Toronto Stock Exchange, the venture exchange of the stock exchange, and so all our information is publicly available, and financial information, the latest news, and so on. So they can go on to a couple of ways they can go on to our stock listing, which is CST, which is our symbol, or else they can register for our news alerts and mailings and so on, or press releases. And as soon as we come out with something as a publicly listed company, we must share the news that's material, and so that's a good way of following us.
Okay, well, great. Mr. Price, I just want to thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you talking to me. I've learned a lot. I think this stuff is really cool. So I'm just really happy that we got a chance to talk.
Alex, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. The purpose of the show is to highlight the stories of people helping to solve some of our biggest challenges. So if you or someone you know would be a good fit for the show, I would love to interview you. The more great information we can broadcast to the world, the better. So feel free to reach out to me via the contact form on my site, whatonearthradio.com, or on Twitter at WOE Radio. And until next time, thanks for listening.